She whispered it at 2 in the morning when she thought I was asleep. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I heard her soft voice say, "I love him." She thought no one would ever know. But I recorded every word. And at breakfast, with her parents and our kids sitting at the table, I put it on speaker for everyone to hear. She whispered at 2 a.m. I played it for everyone at breakfast. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you want more stories like this. That night had started like any other. The house was quiet. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound carrying through the dark. The kids were asleep down the hall, and I had drifted in and out of a restless half-dream. I woke up when I felt the bed shift and heard the faint vibration of her phone on the nightstand. Melissa's hand moved quick, almost like she was hiding from someone. She slid out of bed, whispering into the phone, her voice low, careful, but not careful enough. The words sliced through me like glass. "I love you." It wasn't meant for me. It wasn't meant for anyone in this house. It was for someone else entirely. I didn't stir, didn't move. My breathing stayed steady, though inside me, every nerve was burning. For years, I had noticed little cracks. Messages she'd quickly delete, sudden late nights out, smiles that didn't belong to me anymore. But never had I heard her confirm it in her own voice, not until that moment. I reached slowly under the pillow, pulling out the small recorder I sometimes used for work notes. The red light glowed faintly as I hit record. I didn't think, I just acted. Her whisper carried into the quiet room, every syllable sealing itself onto that tape. I let it play out until she slipped back into bed, her breathing soft and steady, as though she had just returned from a dream instead of tearing mine apart. I stared at the ceiling for hours, the recording resting on the nightstand like a loaded weapon. I didn't wake her. I didn't ask questions. The anger was there, coiled and sharp, but colder than I had ever felt before. I thought of our children, of her parents who were coming over the next morning for Sunday breakfast, of the image she always tried to protect. Perfect wife, devoted mother, the woman who had it all under control. My silence would be her undoing. When dawn finally came, I rose before anyone else. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen as I set the table with plates, forks, and glasses, each clink of porcelain against what a small act of patience. The kids shuffled and sleepy-eyed. Her parents followed not long after, cheerful and ready for pancakes. Melissa came last, dressed neatly, her smile polished as ever, hiding the secret she thought was still hers alone. I greeted everyone, kept my voice steady, and poured orange juice into each glass. No one could see the storm that had already settled inside me. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting the room in golden light. Laughter and casual chatter filled the space, and Melissa sat across from me, looking relaxed, safe, untouched. But I knew, and the recorder sat in my pocket, silent for now, waiting. I ate slowly, my eyes never leaving her face as she talked about errands, about how tired she was, about the little things that meant nothing. She had no idea that her words from the night before were about to rise again, this time in front of every person she thought she could fool. The air at the breakfast table was warm and filled with the usual smells of pancakes, syrup, and freshly brewed coffee. Melissa's mother, Susan, chatted cheerfully about the garden she had been working on, while her father, Richard, was asking the kids about school. The children giggled over some private joke, their plates already messy with fruit and whipped cream. Could have been any ordinary Sunday morning. To them it was, but to me, the room felt like a stage, and every voice and every laugh was only building toward the moment I had been carrying with me since the night before. I kept my head slightly lowered as I poured more coffee into Richard's mug, my eyes flicking across the table toward Melissa. She looked radiant, perfectly composed, her hair falling just so, her makeup subtle but enough to impress her parents. She knew how to play her part, and she played it flawlessly. Yet beneath her carefully crafted expression, I noticed the way her fingers tapped lightly against her cup, a small nervous habit she thought no one ever noticed. I listened as she complimented the food, told her mother she looked lovely, and reminded our youngest not to spill juice on his shirt. To anyone else, she was the picture of grace and warmth. To me, She was a stranger who had whispered, "I love him," into the darkness only hours before. Every word she spoke now sounded hollow. My chest was tight, not with pain, but with the heavy calm of someone who knows he holds the truth in his pocket. I didn't need to argue with her. I didn't need to accuse her in whispers or behind closed doors. I had something better. I had her own voice, fragile and undeniable, waiting to be played back. As the meal went on, Melissa leaned across the table, laughing at something her father said, her hand briefly resting on my wrist as though everything between us was perfectly intact. The touch felt foreign, calculated, like part of the performance. I forced a small smile, but my mind was locked on what I knew. I thought of how easily she had lied, how quickly she had chosen to give herself to someone else, and how certain she must have been that she would never be caught. That was the part that stung. Not the betrayal itself, but the arrogance of her secrecy. She believed her role as wife and mother was unshakable, her reputation untouchable. She never imagined that one night's careless whisper could bring it all crashing down. I reached into my pocket, feeling the recorder there, small and unassuming, yet heavier than any weapon. My thumb traced over the button as I listened to the conversation around me drift from light-hearted jokes to plans for the afternoon. I could have spoken then, cut through the chatter with accusations and anger, but that wasn't what I wanted. Words could be denied, arguments could be twisted, but a voice, a confession spoken into the quiet of the night, was absolute. I pictured the look that would spread across her face when she heard herself, when her parents heard her, when even the children understood what those words meant. It would be a moment she could never erase, a wound to her pride deeper than anything I could ever say. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, my gaze steady on her. She caught my eyes for a moment and smiled, unaware of the storm she was about to face. I studied her carefully, memorizing the ease with which she played her part. It was almost admirable, the way she could sit there so casually after spending the night whispering to another man. Almost. But admiration wasn't what I felt. It was clarity. The kids asked for more pancakes. Susan began clearing the plates, and Richard pushed his chair back slightly, patting his pocket for his glasses. The moment felt perfectly ordinary, and that was exactly why it was perfect. No one suspected anything. No one imagined that the fragile surface of their Sunday ritual was about to crack wide open. I pulled the recorder from my pocket and set it gently on the table, the sound of it clicking against the wood enough to draw Melissa's eyes. She frowned slightly, tilting her head. "What's that?" she asked, her tone light, still performing for her parents, still sure of herself. I didn't answer. My thumb pressed the button, and the room filled with a faint static before her voice came through, low and unmistakable. "I love him," the recording whispered, the words drawn out, intimate, piercing the calm of the breakfast table. The chatter stopped. Forks clattered against plates. The children froze mid-bite, and Susan's hand stilled on a coffee cup. The silence that followed was like a sharp intake of breath, suspended and heavy. Melissa's face went pale instantly, the color draining as her eyes widened. That's not what it sounds like," she stammered, her voice higher than usual, desperate. She looked around the table, her gaze darting from her parents to the kids, then back to me. But the voice on the recorder played again, as if mocking her, sealing the truth into the room where no excuse could touch it. Her fork slipped from her hand, clattering loudly against the plate, the only sound in a room that had gone utterly still. Richard set his napkin down slowly, his jaw tightening. Susan's eyes filled with confusion and shame. The children stared at their mother, not fully understanding, but sensing the gravity of the moment. Melissa tried to laugh weakly, shaking her head. It's taken out of context. I was joking with a friend. You're twisting this." Her words fell flat, brittle in the air, as though even she didn't believe them. And I sat there, silent, watching her world collapse one whisper at a time. Melissa's voice cracked as she tried again to explain herself, her hands trembling as she reached for her glass of orange juice. "It's not what you think," she said, forcing a weak smile that looked more like a grimace. I was half asleep. I was talking nonsense. You know how dreams can sound. But the excuses fell flat in the silence that filled the kitchen. Her parents were staring at her with eyes that no longer carried pride, but something closer to disbelief and hurt. The kids shifted uneasily in their seats, their forks untouched, their small faces filled with confusion they didn't yet have the words for. Her father, Richard, was the first to move. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed back his chair. The sound of the wooden legs scraping against the floor was harsh in the stillness of the room. He didn't look at Melissa at all. His eyes, sharp and cold, landed on me for just a second, and in that glance, I understood everything. He knew what had been said was real. He didn't need me to explain, didn't need to hear anything more. Without a word, he stood, walked to the side of the table, and put his hand on our son's shoulder. The boy looked up at his grandfather, uncertain, but obedient. Richard gave a small nod, and together they walked toward the doorway. The sound of their footsteps leaving the room was deafening. Susan remained seated, her hands folded tightly together as if in prayer, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't move to defend her daughter. She didn't even blink. Melissa turned to her, desperation etched into every line of her face. "Mom, you believe me, right? Tell him this isn't what it sounds like. Please, say something." But Susan didn't answer. She sat like stone, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her, as if she couldn't bear to look at her daughter. I stayed in my seat, my hands resting on the table, calm and steady. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The recording had done the work for me, and Melissa was unraveling on her own. She leaned forward, her voice rising in pitch. "It was just a mistake, okay? A stupid mistake. You're making it into something it isn't. Why would you humiliate me like this? In front of my parents? In front of the kids?" Her words tumbled out fast, almost frantic, but there was no conviction behind them. She wasn't defending the truth. She was clawing at excuses that slipped through her fingers like sand. The children sat quietly, wide-eyed. Our daughter clutched her fork, staring at her mother as if she no longer recognized the woman sitting across from her. Melissa noticed and tried to smile at them, her voice softening. "Sweetheart, it's just mommy being silly. Nothing to worry about." But the more she tried to control the room, the more obvious it became that control had slipped away from her entirely. She turned back to me then, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and fear. "Why didn't you talk to me first? Why didn't you come to me privately instead of putting me on trial like this?" Her words spat out, sharp and accusing, as though somehow I had wronged her by refusing to keep her secret. I met her gaze without flinching, my silence cutting deeper than any response could. It was the silence of someone who had already decided, someone who no longer felt the need to fight or plead. Melissa's breathing quickened. She pushed her chair back suddenly, the legs screeching against the floor, and stood. She began pacing the room, her movements sharp and erratic. "You're making a scene for no reason. You're trying to make me look like the villain when you don't even know the full story." She laughed bitterly, but her voice cracked at the end. The room didn't give her anything back. No support, no laughter, no defense. Just stillness. From the corner of my eye, I saw Susan close her eyes briefly, as though the weight of shame was too much to bear. The kids sat frozen, their faces pale, their breakfasts forgotten. I remained in my chair, my eyes following Melissa's movements but my body perfectly still. My quietness only fueled her panic. She stopped suddenly and slammed her hand on the table. "Say something, damn it. Yell at me. Fight with me. Do anything but sit there like I'm already guilty." But I didn't. The calm in me was unshakable, colder than her fury, steadier than her excuses. The truth was already laid bare, and nothing she said or did could bury it again. Every frantic word, every desperate gesture only deepened the hole she had dug for herself. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and the easy rhythm of family, now felt like a courtroom without a judge. The evidence had been presented, and the verdict was written on every face in the room. Melissa stood there trembling, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths, looking for someone, anyone, to side with her. But no one did. I leaned back in my chair, folded my arms across my chest, and let the silence settle once more. It was louder than her shouting, more final than any words I could have spoken. Melissa's hand lingered on the table after she slammed it down, her knuckles white, her eyes darting around as if someone, anyone, would step in and rescue her from the silence that surrounded her. But no one moved. Susan sat frozen, her gaze downcast, her lips pressed so tightly together they had lost their color. Richard's footsteps had faded down the hall, and the faint creak of the back door confirmed he had taken our son outside, away from the wreckage of the scene. The children still at the table were motionless, their forks untouched, their wide eyes shifting from me to their mother and back again. Melissa was alone, exposed, and the weight of it pressed visibly against her shoulders. She tried again, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. I was confused. I was lonely. Her words broke off, and she let out a nervous laugh that only deepened the unease in the room. "It's not what you're all thinking. It's complicated." She looked at me as if daring me to speak, as if hoping I would offer her a line she could grab onto, some argument to soften the blow. But I gave her nothing. My silence was deliberate, unbreakable, and it grew louder with every second that passed. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time that morning, she sat back down, deflated. She reached out toward our daughter, her hand shaking. "Sweetheart, you believe Mommy, don't you? You know I'd never do anything to hurt this family." But our daughter recoiled, sliding her chair back slightly, the innocence in her face replaced with something that looked dangerously close to mistrust. That simple movement seemed to pierce Melissa deeper than any word could. She pulled her hand back quickly, her expression crumbling, her mask slipping entirely. I stayed still, letting the silence continue to gnaw at her. My calmness was no accident. It was the final blow, more devastating than anger or shouting could ever be. She wanted me to yell, to rage, to give her an opening to play the victim. But there was none of that left in me. Only the steady certainty of someone who had already made peace with the truth. Richard returned after a few minutes, his hand resting gently on our son's shoulder as they stepped back inside. He didn't sit down again, didn't rejoin the table. Instead, he looked at Melissa with eyes so sharp and unyielding that she flinched under them. "Enough," he said simply, his voice low and steady, but filled with finality. He turned to me then, gave a small nod of acknowledgement, and walked back out of the room with his grandson. Susan rose quietly, her chair scraping softly against the floor, and followed them without a word. The kitchen was emptier now, the air heavy. Melissa sat across from me, her face pale, her tears streaking her makeup. "Tom, please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We can fix this. You don't have to destroy me like this. We can talk. Just the two of us." She was begging now, but it was too late. The recording had already spoken for me, her parents had already seen, the children had already heard. The lie she had wrapped herself in for so long had unraveled in a matter of seconds, and there was no stitching it back together. I rose from my chair slowly, every movement deliberate. I gathered my plate, carried it to the sink, and set it down without a word. Melissa's eyes followed me, wide and desperate, as though she were watching her last chance slip through her fingers. "Say something," she pleaded again, her voice breaking. "Please, just say something." But I didn't. I walked past her, calm and steady, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the hollow space that had once been filled with family chatter. At the doorway, I paused and turned slightly, meeting her gaze one final time. The silence between us was louder than any scream, heavier than any accusation. It was the silence of truth, of finality, of a bond severed beyond repair. Melissa lowered her face into her hands, her shoulders shaking, her sobs muffled by the empty room. The children remained seated, too stunned to move, their eyes fixed on the woman they thought they knew. I stepped out into the hallway, the weight of years of lies falling away with every step I took. In that moment, I understood something I had never realized before. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that doesn't speak at all. Sometimes silence is sharper than a knife, louder than a scream, and stronger than 1,000 words. And as I closed the door behind me, leaving her to face the wreckage of her choices, I knew she finally understood that too. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you want more stories like this.